Okay. Okay. We make a change in the plan of the today. We had to do it because the female genital organs and male genital organs is missed in the last program. I add a 2 lesson, one of them to today at the 2 o'clock after a lunch. And in male genital organs, I send the time of that to your presenter and it's shared with you. Let's take a look to the today lesson. In this lesson, we try to learn ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. Excuse me. Thank you so much. In this lesson, we describe the general function of urinary system and this different structure inside the urinary system. For example, the urinary tract start by the ureters in both sides. They are transferred the urine, the produced urine in the kidney to the bladder. After that, talk about the different feature and anatomical feature of the urinary bladder. And in the last part of the lesson, try to learn different things about urethra, major events of mixturation, and in the last slide, we talked about the adrenal or suprarenal gland. It's a part of the adrenal gland or suprarenal gland is a part of the endocrine system in the body, but this is located on top of the kidney. For this reason, sometimes in some methods or in some lectures, it's explained in this part. Let's take a look to the system. If you remember, we talk about a different part or different organs of the urinary system. It's start by kidney, passing through ureters and urinary bladder, and ending with urethra. The kidney is famous as a primary organs of the system because the produce of the urine is done in this organ. It's filter the waste products from the bloodstream and convert the filtrate to the urine. The tract is made of different parts: ureters, urinary bladder, urethra. These are named as a tract because they transport the urine out of the body. If you remember, we learned or you see the same slide in the last lesson. It's the same. It's explained the same things. We divided the system into main organ and urinary tract. You can see the location. Let me take my laser pointer. You see the location of the kidney in dorsal view of the body, and you can see the projection of the ureters on this photo. One of them located in there, it's the right ureter, and this one is a left ureter. If compare the lengths of these two structure with each other, you can find that or figure out the right ones is shorter compared to the left ones. If you remember, we talked about the same condition in the right kidney. It's located 2 or 3 centimeters lower than the left ones. For this reason, the right ureter is shorter than the left ones. You can see the location of the urinary bladder inside the minor pelvis. You can see the same structure in anterior view. This after dissection, the different organs inside the abdomen. These are the different organs of the digestive system, if you remember. Small intestine, large intestine, pancreas, and different organs, for example, a stomach, liver located in there. You can see the same organs, left ureter, right ureter, and urinary bladder. The ureters is the cylindric tubes about 25 centimeter longs in the left side and 23 or 22 in the right side, leaving each pelvis, each renal pelvis or connected to the renal pelvis, one for each kidney, and carries bladder from the kidney to the urinary bladder. Both of this structure descend retroperitoneally and cross pelvic rim. If you remember, the inlet of pelvis or pelvic rim is the side that you can clearly see on this photo. This is the side of the entrance or the level of the entrance to the pelvic rim. This organ enters to the posterolateral side of the bladder, run medially within posterior bladder wall before opening into interior. This oblique enters help to prevent the backflow of the urine, and this last part, 2 or 3 centimeter last part inside a wall make a function look like a sphincter. Excuse me. Okay. We can divide the ureters into different anatomical part. The first part of this organs located inside the abdominal cavity, you can see it here. And the second part of this organ located inside the pelvic cavity, and the last part, as I mentioned before, located in the wall of the bladder. This part is famous as an intramural part, or the part is embedding in the wall of the bladder. This organ extends retroperitoneally, entire the lesser pelvis at the bifurcation side of the common iliac artery. You can see it clearly in there. This is the level of the pelvic rim, or the level that this organ crossed the bifurcation side of the common iliac artery. And then they run along the lateral wall of the pelvis and enters urinary bladder from the posterolateral side. We can talk about the initiation part of each part. For example, totally ureters initiate at the level of the uretropelvic junction. It's the side that pelvic renal pelvis connected to the ureter, and it's famous as the uretropelvic junction. It goes down laterally on the anterior surface of the dorsal abdominal muscle, comes down to the level of the pelvis brim or pelvis inlet, cross the common iliac artery at the level of the bifurcation, goes inside the pelvis and enter into the wall of the bladder. We can talk about a different constrictions in this organ. We have three different constriction. Um, the first constriction is seen at the level of the junction between the ureter and renal pelvis. This point anatomically named as a uretropelvic junction. The second constriction point is at the level of the pelvis brim, or where this structure crossed the common iliac. And the last narrowest part of this organs is the part that it's embedding in the wall of the bladder, or intramural part. And why these are important for us? When the different kidney stone transfer during this tube can close this tube in this 3 point, because these are the narrow part. But the narrowest one is the third ones, or the part that passing through the bladder. It's so important. After these are generally the transfer of the stone during this tube is painful, more painful, and it's generally closed this narrowest part, and this narrowest part is generally controlled in the patient after a pain by use of sonography generally. You can see the last part of the ureters, or the part of the ureters that embedding in the wall of the bladder. This part has an oblique course that constitutes a one or work as a one-way follow wall, and contract of the bladder wall act as this sphincter to preventing the reflux of the ureter inside this organ. And this part is made by three different layers: the inside mucosa, the muscular wall, and the adventitia, or the part of the periton in the surface of that. Excuse me. Why it's important? Because why I try to explain it, because the urine produced drop by drop, and transferred during this tube drop by drop, and the gravity and the peristaltic contraction during this tube transferred the produced urine to the bladder. It's so important function. You can see it in here. The inside lumen of this organs is so narrow and only let to transfer the spatial volume of the fluid. These organs, or this part, have a different relation. For example, the right ureter related by different organs. For example, you can see, as you can see in here, have the first part, or initiate part, be in contact with duodenum, the terminal part of the ileum, the right colic and ileocolic vessels, is located on anterior surface of the right ureter. The right testicular artery and ovarian artery passed and crossed the anterior side of this organ. The root of the mesentery that we learn in digestive system is crossed this structure anteriorly. Posteriorly, this organ seated on the um, dorsal abdominal wall and have a near relation with the right psoas muscle. Let me show the right psoas muscle. This big muscle in dorsal wall of the abdomen is named as a psoas Moyer muscle. It's seated on it. Excuse me. And it's dorsally cross the bifurcation of the right common carotid artery, as you see in here. Let me accept your friend to come in. Okay. In the left side, we can talk about a different relationship in the left side. Um, for example, the sigmoid colon, the sigmoid mesocolon, the left colic vessels, the left testicular or ovarian vessels, and the duodenal flexure is the organs or is the structure located in anterior sides of this organ, and posteriorly it's a neighbor with the left psoas muscle and bifurcation of the left common carotid artery. The arterial supply and veins of the ureters is that this organ received a local artery in different level. For example, the abdominal part is supplied blood by the renal artery, directly the initiate part of that, and the arteries comes from the testicular or ovarian artery. You can see it clearly in there. The pelvic part is supply blood by the common and internal iliac artery, as you see in here. Sometimes inferior and superior vesical artery supply blood for the intramural or the last part of the pelvic, the last section of the pelvic part of the ureters. Sometimes the artery of that supply blood for ureters comes from the uterine artery, and that we talk in genital female genital system. It's the artery that supply blood for uterus. The vein is the same, accompany the arteries, having the corresponding name, but in collect the vein in the reverse direction to the inferior vena cava. The lymphatics of the ureters drain into the lumbar, common iliac, external and internal iliac nodes. As you see in here, these are named as the internal iliac lymph nodes, external iliac lymph nodes surrounding the external iliac artery, common iliac lymph nodes surrounding the common iliac artery, and lumbar is this one. And these are nearer, these lymph nodes nearer to the lumbar vertebrae. For this reason, these are named as a lumbar lymphatic nodes. The lymphatic drainage of the organs is local, where it's nearer is drained to this side. For example, this part is nearer to the lumbar lymph nodes. For this reason, the lymph drained into this part. And partially, it have a different lymphatic drainage, different vessels, different arteries, and different veins. The nerves of the ureters derive from the adjust autonomic plexus. The famous ones is named as a renal plexus, located nearer to the hilum of the kidney in both sides. But we have another plexus, for example, have an aortic plexus, superior hypogastric, and inferior hypogastric plexus that innervated the different part of this organs. The urinary bladder is another part or another organ in the system, collects urine, collect the urine extracted by the kidney before disposed by urination. Is a hollow muscular chamber and distensible or elastic organs, sites on the floor of the pelvis. Urine enters the bladder via the ureters and exit the bladder by use of urethra. You can see the male urethra. If you remember, we talked about urethra in the first lesson. We talked about that this organ or this part of the urinary system is developed at the same time with the external genital organ. For this reason, the structure of the urethra between the gender is different. You can see the male urethra in the Smith-Sagittal section. This is the internal surface or internal mucosa of the bladder. The wall of the bladder is made of special muscle that names as a detrusor muscle, and the surface of that is covered by the adventitia, a layer of the connective tissue. The urinary bladder is a hollow, distensible, and muscular organ located inside the pelvic cavity, posterior to the symphysis pubis and inferior to the parietal peritoneum. For this reason, sometimes this organ named as the position of this organ named as infraperitoneal or retroperitoneal, because located in outside of the peritoneum. Its contact with the anterior wall of the uterus and vagina in female, you can see it in here, and with the rectum in the male, and made a different pouch in the females and the males. And this pouch of the peritoneum is named as a vesicorectal pouch. It's only seen in the males, but in the another part in the female, we can see a two pouch. The anterior ones named as a vesicoureterine pouch, and the dorsal ones or the dorsal pouch of the peritoneum located between the rectum and uterus, named as a rectouterine pouch, or I explain it again in female genital organs, and the specific names of this pouch is the Douglas pouch. It's about the different neighbors in and to gender. In the males, the base of the bladder lies between the rectum and pubis, as I mentioned before. and surrounding by the prostate gland. You can see it in here. It's located superior to the prostate and separated from the rectum by a peritoneal pouch, as I mentioned before. And this pouch here named as a rectovesical excavation or a rectovesical pouch. It's the deep point of the peritoneal cavity. In the female, the bladder sits inferior to uterus and anterior to the vagina. Its maximum capacity is lower than male because it holds the weight of the uterus. It's separated from the uterus by the vesicouterine pouch or vesicouterine excavation. It's located in there. And in infants and young children, the urinary bladder is in the abdomen, and it's the abdominal organ, even when it's empty. But after the changing or after the increasing the internal capacity of the pelvis, this organs goes down and seated inside the minor pelvis or lesser pelvis. Urinary bladder, sometimes named as a vesica urinaria, it's the Latin name of this structure or this organ. When it's empty, it's entirely within the pelvic cavity. As it fills, it starts to rise above the pelvic brim and come and contact with the anterior wall of the abdomen. If fully distended, it may rises as high as the umbilicus. During infancy and early childhood, even the empty bladder is largely about the pelvis brim, and it's named as abdominal organ in children. Then we talked about that it goes down by the increased capacity of the real pelvis. It contacts the anterior wall of the uterus and vagina in the female and lies posteriorly against the rectum in the male. You can see the normal position of the bladder when it's empty and when it's full with bladder. It's blew up as a balloon. And when empty, it's flattened, have a different anatomical part. For example, it have a base or fundus located in this side, have an apex, is the anterior angle of infralateral surface. This side named as the apex of the urinary bladder, and this apex side connected to the umbilicus by the specific ligament named as a median umbilical ligament internally. And the neck is the inferior angle of this organ. Here is named as a neck part. Neck surrounding by prostate gland in the male, but in the female it's spear and continue with urethra. The body is the superior and infralateral surface of the bladder. You can imagine that this is the apex. Here, posterolateral side named as a fundus. Here is the neck. And except this region, another part named as a body of the urinary bladder. You can see the different opening inside a mucosa of the urinary bladder. Uh, you can see the two uh, ureteric ostia or ureteric orifice or ureteric opening in both sides. You can see smooth side between the internal opening of urethra and two ureters opening. This trigon is named as a vesical trigon, outlined by this three opening, and interureteric fold is seen in here. You can see the elevation in this site that famous as uvula. The musculature of urinary bladder is so important. It has a four-layer inner mucose coat, a submucose coat, and a muscular coat in external side. And in outer side, we have a special layer that names as a serous coat. Smooth muscle fibers comprise the detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of the bladder wall, can extend and can contract again, have a specific muscle group. The muscle bundles run longitudinally, transversely, and obliquely, but not circular. Um, Internal sphincter of the bladder prevents urine from entering the urethra. It's located at this level and located in different side between and external ones located in different side between two gender. As I mentioned, the internal mucosa of the urinary bladder or vesica urinaria is have a manifold. This fold names as a ruga or vesical ruga, and but we have a spatial smooth triangle that based on that space located above, and tips or apex of that is located below. This triangular shape part names as the vesical trigger. You can see the flow or direction of the flow inside the uriner. It comes from above and goes inside a bladder. And only you can see the one direction or unique direction flow inside the uriner, inside the excuse me, inside the ureter in normal condition. You can see the dorsal view of these organs in the male and cross section or coronal section of this organ in urinary bladder. You can see the prostate gland that's surrounding the cervix part of the urinary bladder. You can see the entrance of the ureters in both sides and the different layer of the wall. The inside layer of the mucosa membrane, submucose coat under this layer, muscles or detrusor muscle, and the superficial coating or serous coat of the bladder. Okay, we can have a break about 7 minutes. Please be in class 10 minutes later. If you have a question, I'm ready to answer.
Hocam mikrofonunuz kapalı.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's take a look to the second part of this lesson. As I mentioned before, we talked about the difference of the urethra between the two gender. We have a short urethra in female gender, but we have a long ones in the male. Let's take a look to the structure of this part. The urethra, as I mentioned before, the location of the internal urethral sphincter is the same. It's located at the level of the um, neck of vesica urinaria, or in surrounding the initiate part of the urethra in both gender, and the external urethral sphincter is located in urogenital diaphragm into gender. Um, Another important things between or the difference between these two group of sphincter is that the internal urethral sphincter is worked involuntary and controlled by the autonomic system, but the external urethral sphincter is work voluntary, look like another part of the system, or look like another sphincters in the body, where we have a two sphincter, generally the internal ones controlled by the autonomic system, and make an impulse of the filling, and the external ones work voluntary. The urethra is a tube that conveys urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. Its wall is lined with a mucosa membrane, and it has a thick layer of the longitudinal muscle fibers during the wall of this structure. The internal mucosa of the urethra continues with the internal mucosa of the bladder, and it's make a complicated condition in the case of the urinary tract infection. You can see the structure in there. As I mentioned before, urethra initiate at the inferior side of the urinary bladder at the point that the mucosa is finished, or in the on the inferior side of the apex of the vesical trigon. You can see the three opening, as I mentioned before. The superior ones is the opening of the ureter, but the inferior ones is the opening of the urethra. These are, we have a two opening of urethra. One of them connected the urethra into urinary bladder. It's famous as the internal urethral opening, excuse me. And one of them connected to the urethra to the outside of the body. That's famous as an external urethral opening or external urethral orifice. In the female urethra, it's about 4 centimeters long. It runs obliquely and have a nearer, nearer neighbors. It's neighbored anteriorly with the symphysis pubis and posteriorly by the vagina. Let's take a look to the mid-sagittal section. You can see it in here. Here you can see the passage of the urethra from the pelvic diaphragm. This is the side of the setting of the external urethra or sphincter. Have a different neighbors. Anteriorly, it's neighbored with the dorsal surface of the symphysis pubis, and posteriorly, it's neighbored by the vagina. You can see the pelvic diaphragm in, let me take my laser pointer, excuse me. You can see the pelvic diaphragm in female and pelvic diaphragm in the male. Both of the external urethral sphincter located in there, in the male located inside, and in the female located in this side. But the internal ones surrounding the initiate part of the urethra into gender. Let's take a look to another topic. In the male, we have a long urethra. It's about 70.5 centimeters long. It has a dual function for both urination and reproduction, and it has a three section or three part. Sometimes in some references, it's divided into four part, but in some references, we can see the three parts of that. In the fourth part, we divided the urethra into the preprostatic, prostatic urethra, membranous urethra, and penile or spongious urethra. The preprostatic is the site that's surrounding by internal urethral sphincter. Prostatic is the part that passes through or goes through the prostate gland. Membranous part is the part that pierces the pelvic diaphragm and surrounding by the external urethral sphincter, and the penile or spongious part of the urethra is the part that's located inside the spongious body of the penis. You can see the same structure. Let's take a look to the part in the mid-sagittal section. This side or initiate part is famous as the periprostatic. Inside the prostate, it's named as a prostatic. Then we have a 1 or 2 centimeters named as a membranous urethra, and the last part is famous as a penile urethra or spongious urethra. This parts of the penis is made by the spongious tissue. For this reason, this site of the urethra is famous as a penile urethra or spongious urethra. You can see the two opening of these organs, the internal urethral orifice and external urethral orifice. Elimination of urine is important. We talked about that during the lectures, but I like to summarize it again. After forming along the nephron, urine passes to the collecting ducts. If you remember, this collecting ducts opening to the renal papilla. After, by use of different foramina on renal papilla in the side, these are transferred to the minor calyx, after that to the major calyx, then to the renal pelvis, goes through the ureters, transferred to the urinary bladder. After that, the urethra carries the urine out of the body. It's the pathway that urine transferred through it to goes or receive to out of the body. The mixturation is a complex function and need a different receptors and need a different need to the different performance during the parasympathetic and sympathetic function. For example, urinary bladder distance as it fills with urine, the stretch receptors in the bladder wall are stimulated and the signal of the mixturation center is sent to the sacral segments of the spinal cord. Parasympathetic nerves impulse travel to the detrusor muscle, which responds by contracting rhythmically. Um, and you feel you need to urinate is urgent. Voluntary contraction of the external urethral sphincter and inhibition of the mixturation is the reflex by the impulse comes from the brain stream and cerebral cortex to prevent urination. Following the decision to urine, the external urethral sphincter is relaxed voluntary and impulses from the pons and hypothalamus facilitated the mixturation reflex. The detrusor muscles contracts and the urine is expelled through the urethra. This is a complex pathway of the that contain the different reflexes and different receptors in the wall of the bladder and can have parasympathetic components or it's heart function at the level of the pons and hypothalamus. Another things I like to talk about that is the urinary tract infection. A urinary tract infection is an infection in any part of your urinary system, maybe in kidney, in ureters, in bladder or urethra. Most infection involve the lower urinary tract and contains the bladder or urethra or both of them together. You can see the different part of this system, the kidney, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. Generally, the infectious material comes from out of the body to the system because it's work and sterile condition. For this reason, generally, the opening of the system to the outside of the body is due to the external orifice of the urethra. You see the external orifice of the urethra in both gender. The urinary tract infection is common in the female compared to the male because the infectious material pass through the narrow and short passage in female to reach to the bladder, but in the male it goes through a long way to reach to the bladder. For this reason, the chance of the urinary infection in the woman's increased compared to the man's. The infection of the urinary urinary tracts can occur at different points, including the bladder. An infection in the bladder is famous as a cystitis. or a bladder infection. And the kidney sometimes is infected, and it's a so important condition, and it's called as a pyelonephritis. The ureters is not infected, rarely infected, or rarely only site of the infection. Generally, ureters and kidney infected together, and urethra and bladder infected at the same time. The infection of the urethra is famous as ureteritis. These are so important terms. Keep these terms in your mind. Cystitis is the infection of the bladder. Pyelonephritis is the infection of the kidney. And ureteritis is the infection of the urethra. As I mentioned before, women tend to get them more often than the male. These are genetically and anatomically is close to the urinary tract infection. And the main infectious materials is Escherichia coli, is a type of the bacteria that live inside the rectum and can goes anteriorly 3 or 4 centimeters and make a cystite in the woman. The last topic I like to talk about that is endocrine special future, have a special future gland that names as an adrenal gland. As another gland of the body, it's a part of the endocrine system. But I like to explain the future of this or place in there. Adrenal gland is located on the superior pole of the kidney in both sides. We can subdivide it into adrenal medulla and the inside material and adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex is release the different hormones, for example, cortisone, corticosterone, aldosterone, and androgen is the hormones that's secreted from the adrenal cortex, and adrenal medulla is a part of our nerve system. For this reason, it's secreted the epinephrine and norepinephrine. Let's take a look to this organ. Overall, they sits on the top of the kidney, as you see in this photo. If I cut the gland, I can see it's made by two different parenchyms, and the central part is named as adrenal medulla, and the outer side is named as adrenal cortex. The weight of these organs is approximately 4 to 5 grams. Activities of this gland is regulation of the fluid volume and stress response. If you see the different side of these organs, or a cross section of this, or look with a close look to the cross section of this organs, you can find that the surface of this organs is covered by the connective tissue, or have a capsule. Under it, we have a thick cortex zone, and we have a thin medulla part. Adrenal cortex derived from the mesoderm in embryonic life forms the outer region of the gland, comprises the 80% of the glands and secretes the corticosteroids, has a three-layer zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticulare. Adrenal medulla is derived from the neural crest, as I mentioned before. It's embryologically derived from the part that form the nerve system. For this reason, it secreted the epinephrine and norepinephrine and worked as a part of the nerve system and regulated the different function in the body. As I mentioned before, adrenal medulla is thought as a modified sympathetic ganglion, and the hormones it secreted travel through the body by use of bloodstream and done the multiple function in the body and have a multiple target organs. The last thing I like to talk about that is the clinical condition that famous as the adrenal androgen hypersecretion. And this androgens is done the different function in the gender or in terms of the different life period. When we can see when the secretion of the androgen is increased in adult female, you can see the muscularization or hirsutis. This is the condition we can see in polyovarian cyst in the females. In both conditions, the androgen level in the blood is increased, and you can see the hirsutis. In the female embryo, the increase in androgen level of the blood is made the female pseudo-hermaphrodites, and in adult male, it's no effect because these are normally have a high level of the androgen. Hirsutism is a so important condition, and it's the symptom of the different hormonal increase in the body, but generally seen after increasing the androgen from the different sources. Sometimes these sources may be the adrenal gland. Sometimes it's seen in different patient after, for example, the polycystic ovarian. But I like to know that the hyperfunction or hypersecretion of androgen from the adrenal gland is make a hirsutis in the adult female. It's it. If you have a question, I'm ready to answer. If not, see you at 2 for the female genital organ. I'm ready to answer your question if you have. Okay. Have a good day.